And hello and welcome. My name is Martin, and today what we're going to be looking at is collision settings and how to set up the different types of scenarios for our static meshes. Basically what a collision setting is how a mesh is going to interact with the world, or how it's going to allow different classifications of or groups to interact with it. And so let's take a look at the different things that we will be actually talking about, and then we'll go a little bit more in depth with them. So if I select a static mesh and I go into the details panels, the things that we're going to be looking at is going to be this tab right here called mobility. We're going to be looking at static, stationary, and mobile. And then the other thing we'll be looking at are the collision settings. And if you have never opened these up before, it should look like this. So we'll take a look at what are the collision presets, and then the object types. So basically the way that collisions work is you give the collision a object type, and based on that object type it will then classify, it gets grouped into that classification, sort of like a team, and then it deals with other members of different classifications by doing one of three things: either ignoring that group, overlapping with that group, or blocking that group. So if I look here, this object, or the mesh that I have selected right now, has the word in object types world static. If we come down here to the bottom, we'll see world static. So this object, which is labeled as a world static, will block other objects that are also labeled as a world static. So if I look at the object below it, this one is labeled as a world static. So these two are going to block each other. And we'll get into the rest of this in a minute. I don't want to get too detailed right now. So basically, let's just take a quick look at the first option that we talked about up here underneath mobility. So we have static, we have stationary, and we have mobile. The two that we're probably going to use the most is going to be static and movable. Static objects basically do not change in the game. The other thing that they also do is that they render faster. So if you know that you're not going to be moving that object, there's no need for that object to be quote-unquote movable. It can be static. And what that means basically is that the shadow that it generates doesn't need to change because the light's not changing in the scene. So because of that, it doesn't have to render that information, which makes your whole processing a little bit lighter. So for example, let me go ahead and push play. The first objects that are here are movable. Whoops, I'm in the wrong area. Let's go over here. So these first objects are labeled as movable. If I hit them, you'll see that they do move. And let's try to get one of these. And there you can see its shadow. And that shadow is dynamic. It is constantly changing because this object is labeled as a movable. Okay, let's click on one of these, and you'll see that that one is not moving, and these are labeled as static. Now the neat thing about statics is that you can see their shadow, it's not moving, so again the computer doesn't have, and there's another shadow right there, so the computer doesn't have to redraw shadows. Let's jump up. And the other thing we can do with statics is, since they don't move, you can have a whole network of, like, let's say jumping platforms or things that people have to jump between, and they will take the weight, and they do this cool thing where they feel like they're suspended in the air. So you can create things that are on the ground that move both, and I've got these programs so that they will move, or they are blocking both the projectiles themselves, other objects. Basically they say blocking all, right? So it's like it's got a solid, it's got its own shape. Okay. The other one that we didn't talk about is the stationary. So let's click on one of these. Now what stationary does is, stationary basically would be something like a light switch. It's something that your character does need to interact with, but it physically doesn't move in the environment. So because it doesn't move, again, it's going to render a little bit faster. It doesn't need dynamic shadows, or it doesn't need to recreate and do shadows, because the object itself is not going to move. But it does allow for the character to manipulate it, so it does allow for something to be attached to it, but not necessarily that the object needs to move. All right, so that's the difference between a static, a stationary, and a movable. And you can see right just between those things, those three objects right there change the way those meshes work big time. All right, so now let's take a closer look at collision settings. So with the collision settings, we're going to see the first option is generate hit, or simulation generates a hit, generate hit events. So basically between these two things, if we look down here, we're looking at overlap events and we're looking at blocks. Blocks would be like hits. So if this thing generates a hit, it's generating, so it basically it's allowing us to say this object got touched by something, so now in the code we want it to do something. And we'll see this later when we set up the stationary mine, that when we walk into the mine, it's going to react to either the pawn touching it or the projectile touching it, in which case it will eventually explode because that's what a mine does. But we will have to set up a condition and click here on that it generates the event, so then that way we can write that into our code. So we'll see that in a little bit. Just realize that that's what those two first options are. Now from there, the next option is, can the character step on it? So in most situations it's probably okay unless you don't want them to be able to step on it. There is actually an enemy that I have back here, which is a ball, and because it's a rounded surface, it's actually really easy for a character to get swept up or get picked up by that. So in a situation like this, I might have that particular enemy not allow the character to be able to step on it, right? So with that, let's look at the next thing, which is the collision presets. Now, in the first two examples, I was using a block all and a block all. In this one, I'm actually using in setting 4, setting 3, I'm using an overlap all. And I'm doing an overlap all with a movable in the first one, and the second one is going to be a overlap all with a static. And let's actually look and see what actually happens with that when we push play. Now, with the first set, it actually fell through the floor. Now, that's because we have them set to overlap all, so it didn't block. It didn't stop. It didn't not allow another surface to get past its own surface, right? So they weren't occupying the same space. That's what the block would do, right? But with the overlap, basically what happened is it overlapped with everything. So when we look at the code for that, and we click on and we go to collision settings and we look at the preset overlap all and we look at overlap, look what it basically is. It is no physics collision, so it's not going to touch anything. Nothing's going to be able to touch it. And if it's overlapping everything, basically it means that it's going to fall through. Everything and the fact that it's movable made it to where it could move. Now with this one was an overlap all also, but the difference here is not in the collision settings, but up here underneath mobility, we have it set to static. So because it's static, the object itself doesn't move. So basically the effect that we're going to get over here if we push play is the first set falls through the floor, and the second set, we're basically going to be able to walk through them and just the pawn. So let's look at why. Let's click on one of these, and if we scroll down, we can see that it is blocking projectiles and it is blocking enemies, which is a preset that I put in there, so don't worry about enemies. But projectile is definitely being blocked. So if you were to use an overlap all, it would allow your character to be able to walk through it because you're labeled as a pawn, but the ammunition, the yellow balls that you're shooting out with your they will be blocked by that object. So now let's look at the next one. Let's look at a different set. So with this set, what I have is no collision as a preset. So let's click on a box. Let's look underneath the no collision preset, and let's look at basically it is blocking everything but no collision. Now with these I've left as movable, so let's see if it blocks everything, whether I can actually run into these things or not with this set of conditions. So let's push play. And let's see what set number, I believe it was down here. So that's the set, right? No collisions with movability. So they themselves are not moving because they are not interacting with me because this has been set to no collisions. Let's see if I can. I wish I could get a box here that I could move. Let's see if I can interact with those. No. So we're getting no collision, but maybe in the scene or something, this is something that's in the background that you're going to program to move, but not necessarily that you want to interact with the character or anything that the character is doing. So in this case, it would go right through. So maybe something like a ghost. If these would be the perfect settings for like something that was transparent that would move towards you like a mist, but so that you did want to quote unquote program it and move it, but you're not necessarily wanting it to interact with yourself or with the let's say the projectile that we're shooting at it. So this would be a good ghost or a good material, let's say like a mist or a hologram. That would be a great material for a hologram. That would be a great collision settings for something like that. Your character would be able to walk through, but not be interact, and the hologram would still be programmable and movable. Here we maybe have the same thing, but maybe the hologram is staying in one place and we don't want it to actually move. So, you know, maybe a screen, a projection, some kind of trying to think like a holographic projection screen or something like that. This would be perfect for setting number 6. So again, this would be no collisions. It's labeled as a world static. It's not going to interact with anything, and it's not going to move anywhere. Okay, let's look at number 7. So with number 7, we've actually changed this one to ignore pawn only, and it has no collisions and it's movable. So let's actually get a little bit closer to where the action is, so we don't have to drive down quite so far. All right, let's push play. And let's see what happens with these. Okay, so it is obviously not ignoring my, it seems to be blocking my projectiles, but it is ignoring me. So let's click on number 7, and let's indeed see what it is. So with number 7, ignore pawn only, it's ignoring the pawn. It would be ignoring anything in the quote-unquote vehicle class. If you were to come up here and underneath object type, change the vehicle, change it from, let's say, world dynamic to vehicle. And that's why it's not interacting with us, because as a character, your character or the capsule that you are inside of is labeled as a pawn, or your mesh is labeled as a pawn. And again, the balls, the projectiles, the yellow Nerf balls that we're shooting out are projectiles. Let's look at this one is also ignore pawn. These are static. So again, my pawn would be able to go through. It would not interact with anything. Its collision settings are set to absolutely null, except for pawn, which obviously was ignore, and then like this one over here, which is pawn ignore, vehicle ignore, but everything else is on a block. And it's static, so again, these would not move. From there, let's look at our first custom collision. So one of the other things that you can do is maybe there's a certain group of settings that you're looking for and the presets aren't cutting them for you. So from there, what we can do is we can go to custom. Now underneath custom, we basically have access to everything else underneath in the collision settings. So from here, we can look at the first option, which is collision enabled. So there are a couple of things that can happen. You can either not create any collisions. So remember that these are quote-unquote collision settings. So if you have no collisions, it doesn't matter what you've done down here. You're not going to be interacting with anything. Now you can make the collisions listen to two things. You can either make them listen to quote-unquote physics, or you can make them listen to quarry. Now a quarry would be anything that is a non-physics, so like a ray trace, a lights, lots of different things that are not quote-unquote have physical properties. And then from there, physics would be like, let's say, anything that has physics enabled or does or has a physical body, right? So if we allow for physics only, maybe we want these things to fall and we need it to be able to listen to physics so that we can actually create something falling. Maybe we want to query something like we want a light to shine on this and we want it to create a cool shadow in the background, and that would be, again, it would not be physics, but it would be something that we are interacting with the object but not necessarily making it move. The next thing would be the object type. Now this allows you to be able to pick from, look at that, any of the same type of objects that are here in the responses. So basically this set right here is what I can label this mesh as. So then that way, basically I can create groups of meshes that all work, or their collision settings are all exactly the same way, or they all will be read by other meshes as this type. So imagine this as like the easiest way to imagine this would be like football players on a field, and you have like 6 or 7 teams. You know, it's not a standard football game. It would be like, you know, a crazy game where you've got like Chinese checkers, right? Where you've got like 8 teams on the same field, and each one is trying to outdo the other one. And there's certain rules that they have set up for themselves that they can either do one of 3 things when they encounter one of the other objects, right? So they would either be able to ignore the other object, overlap with the other object, or block the other object. So that's why we're seeing here, this one is labeled as a world dynamic. So when it comes into contact with anything else that's world dynamic, it would, you know, block itself. If we label this thing as a world static, now any other groups and any other members that would ignore world statics would now ignore this box. Let's say we wanted things that were world static and we're coming here and we want them to overlap with each other. Maybe this is a pile of something that's falling on top of itself and we want them to occupy, I don't know, less space, who knows. So we would do something with overlapping, so then that way they would be able to, their edges would be able to go into each other. So custom settings. Basically, you create and give it a label. You give it one of the teams, you put it on one of the teams, and then you pick basically what that is going to be able to do. Now the cool thing is up here across the top, if you click the top button, it automatically flips everything in that row to whatever that is. So if I click overlap, if I click block, now then I can come down specifically to each one of the individual ones and then decide what I want, whether I want it to be overlapped, whether I want it to be blocked, or whether I want it to be a world dynamic. So let's put this back to what it was, which I believe was, it was custom. It was a world static. It was enabled with query and physics. So we'll switch this back. And let's go pawn was being overlapped. Put that back. I don't think that matters so much. So pawn was being overlapped and the projectile was being ignored and the object was movable, and it still is. And the other settings, let's just put the other settings to block. Okay, so basically what's going to happen with this object is when I walk into it, I will be able to overlap with it, and it will completely ignore my projectile. So let's check and see if that's actually what's going to happen. So let's grab this guy, move him back. Let's rotate him. And let's see if that's actually what happens. Okay, so it's completely ignoring me, and it's also ignoring my projectile. So with the overlap, well, it's not ignoring me, it's overlapping with me, which means it could generate an overlap event, but it's not going to stop me from not bumping into it. Okay, and let's look at this last custom setting. And this one is a custom setting. It's world static. The query and physics are enabled. It overlaps with pawns, but it blocks projectiles and it's movable. So these I should be able to shoot. And I can. They ignore me. Now the cool thing is look what's happening next door. This one was overlapping pawns, it was ignoring projectiles, but with the custom settings, I did leave other world statics as blocks, right? So even though let's do this. Even though I can't shoot them or interact with them, I can knock other things into them that will interact with them. So it's not that my bullet's going through that. You can see that it's not doing anything. But since I can hit and interact with this one through my projectile, I'm now able to move the other one, right? So cool ideas as far as like maybe creating interesting ideas for games and how people are going to be able to play with your game. All right, so now, so those were custom settings 2. Let's look at custom settings 3. Let's see what we've done here. And with custom settings 3, we did a custom setting, we called it a physics body. We're still blocking our pawn, we're blocking our projectiles. Okay, so basically I just showed you, so basically my point with this custom setting is that we're labeling this, it's always been world static or world dynamic. I'm labeling it as a physics body. I'm still blocking everything. Physics body doesn't really mean anything then, other than it's blocking everything, right? So these presets basically, these presets just mean that, you know, regardless of what it is, it's just, you know, it's still going to block everything. So here it's blocking my pawn, it's blocking my projectile. The word physics body doesn't mean that it's a physics body. It's just a classification. Consider these, you know, static 1 is group 1, world dynamic is group 2, pawn is group 3, physics body is group 4, vehicle is group 5, and then look at what each one of these presets are. Well, I'm still in custom, so let's actually go to, let's say, well, no, that's fine. It's in custom. So regardless of what thing I'm doing, nothing's changing down here. I get to make the changes. Anyways, so basically that's collision settings. Let's do a really quick recap. Basically, you create an object, you grab, and this can only be meshes. You can put the mesh on the floor. You're going to select static, stationary, or movable. Depending on whether you want the object to move, whether your character is going to interact with it, or whether your object is meant to stay in place. From there, you're going to scroll down until you find collision settings. Then you're going to decide here whether it's going to, whenever it gets bumped into or overlapped, whether that generates a hit or an overlap event. From there, you can decide whether the character can stand on it. The next thing is whether you're going to use one of the presets that are there. If you do, look at what the preset is and how it's labeling itself, so then that way you know how it's going to interact with other objects. And the interaction is going to come in whether this is going to be ignored, overlapped, or blocked, right? So those are the 3 things that are going to happen. It's either going to be ignored, it's either going to be overlapped, or it's going to be blocked based on what you've labeled it and what its label means against the other teams, what these guys will then do. Whether it's going to be against what sorry, it's late. Whether this object is going to be, whether the physics body, because it's on the physics body team, will either ignore, overlap, or block anything that has any one of these descriptors. Okay, so in a nutshell, in a long about way, that is the interesting things that you can do with collision settings and how you can create very different feels for many different meshes based on what you need that particular mesh right then and there. Okay, so have a wonderful day. Hope this video was helpful, and in the next one we'll be looking at creating our first enemy, which will be our first blueprint. Okay, so have a wonderful day. Bye bye.